In the autumn of 1879, while most frontier widows were scraping together every cent for flour and firewood, Barbara Keating spent her last $8 on a rotting tannery the entire settlement loathed. The building reeked of decay so powerfully that wagons detoured around it. But inside those freezing stone vats, she saw something no one else could: a winter bedroom for her three boys that would never freeze. What she didn't plan for was what the stench would keep alive when the starving wolves came. Barbara Keating was a woman the frontier had already buried. Her husband dead, no money, three boys, a cabin that would not last the winter. The tannery was a horror: stone vats saturated with rancid fat and decaying hides, a stench so foul it made eyes water 50 yards away. But Barbara saw a fact no one else bothered to notice. Underground, the earth stays just above freezing. Those deep stone basins could be winter bedrooms that never froze solid. But to turn that cursed building into a sanctuary, she first had to scrub every inch of those vats with quicklime until her hands bled. And that was only the beginning of the nightmare. The nightmare started 9 months earlier, on a frozen morning in late January, when Elijah Keating did not come home from the timber camp. A widow pine had snapped wrong, the foreman said. Quick work, clean burial. Barbara stood in the cold while they lowered her husband into ground harder than iron, one hand clutching each of her three boys by the shoulder. Tom, the eldest at 10, held his face still because his father had taught him how. Sam, 7, cried into his mother's skirt without making a sound. And little Will, barely 5, kept asking why Papa wasn't climbing out of the box. That was when Barbara understood she was now the only wall between her children and a world that would bury them too. By spring, the money was gone. Elijah had been a good provider, but good men leave behind only what they carried in their hands. The cabin they lived in was a one-room claim shack with gaps in the sod walls wide enough to see flickers of daylight through. In summer, it was barely shelter. In winter, it would be a coffin. The nearest town was a 3-hour walk. The nearest sympathetic relative was 1,000 miles east in a place called Pennsylvania that now felt as distant as the moon. Barbara had no trade, no claim worth selling, and three mouths that woke up hungry every morning. She sold Elijah's tools, then his boots, then the wedding ring she had worn so long it left a pale ghost on her finger. It was then, while walking back from the general store with a sack of cornmeal that had cost her the last of Elijah's suspenders, that she first truly noticed the old moorland tannery. Everyone in the settlement knew the building, but no one ever looked directly at it. They veered their wagons wide, held handkerchiefs to their noses, and muttered curses when the wind shifted. The place had been empty for nearly 7 years, ever since the tanner, a man named Dutch Haskins, had drunk himself into the river one night and never come up. Before that, he had run the business into the ground. The hides rotted, the vats soured, and the stench of decaying animal flesh and stagnant tanning liquor had soaked so deep into the stones that even hard rain couldn't wash it away. The county had seized the property for back taxes and would have burned it if not for the risk of fire spreading. Instead, it just sat there, festering. But what Barbara saw when she stared through the broken door was not a curse. She saw the vats. 6 enormous stone basins, each nearly 5 feet deep and 7 feet across, built partially into the cold earth because tanning required steady temperatures. Dutch had constructed them by digging down into the ground and lining the pits with thick limestone slabs mortared tight. The walls were dense, the floors were stone, and the lips rose only a few feet above the dirt floor of the building. In a profession that demanded cool, dark spaces to cure hides, these were a necessity. To Barbara, they looked like something else entirely. Underground shelters. The kind that would never drop below freezing, no matter how hard the bitter plains winter screamed overhead. She did not tell anyone what she was thinking. Not the storekeeper, not the preacher, not even Tom, who had become unnaturally quiet since the burial. She simply waited until the autumn tax auction, held outside the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning when most sensible people were busy harvesting the last squash. There were 3 bidders, 2 left shaking their heads when the stench wafted toward them. Barbara, holding a cloth to her face and her last 8 silver dollars inside a cloth purse, raised her hand once and bought the entire property. The clerk paused, looked at her like she had confessed to arson, and then slowly slid the deed across the table. For the price of a second-hand plow, Barbara Keating became the owner of the most hated building in the county. Word spread faster than measles. By afternoon, 3 different neighbors had stopped by her shack to ask if she had lost her mind. The storekeeper's wife told her, not cruelly, that living children need fresh air, not poison vapors. A trapper named Isham Cole, who had known Elijah, simply stood in the doorway and said, "That place'll kill you before the snow does." Barbara listened to all of it, thanked them for their concern, and packed what little she owned into a handcart. The morning they moved, a thin crust of frost already covered the prairie grass. The first thing that hit her when she pushed open the tannery door was the smell. It was not a single odor but a layered assault. Rancid fat, rotted hair, old lime, the ghost of animal bladders long since emptied, and beneath it all the deep, sweet sickness of flesh that had been left to decay in dark corners. The boys gagged. Will vomited. Barbara tied a rag over her face and lit the lantern. Inside, the vats were coated in a crud that had hardened to something like black enamel. Years of old tanning liquor, mixed with animal grease and skin fragments, had congealed into a wax-like shell that would have to be removed entirely before anyone could sleep inside those stone walls. That meant weeks of scrubbing. But here is the thing Barbara understood that everyone else missed. The stone vats were not just pits. They were heat batteries. The ground below the frost line stays a constant 50 to 55 degrees year-round, a fact every root cellar on the frontier relied on. The vats, buried mostly underground, would draw that heat upward into the spaces inside them. If she could make them clean enough to inhabit, they would sleep warm even when the cabin above them froze to the bones of the boards. The work began the next morning. Barbara bought quicklime from the store on credit, a transaction the storekeeper processed with the grim expression of a man selling rope to a condemned prisoner. Quicklime, she knew, would eat away organic matter, but it would also eat skin. She mixed it with water in a bucket until it hissed and steamed, then lowered herself into the first vat. The boys stood above, watching as she attacked the black crust with a stiff brush. Within an hour, her hands were raw. By midday, blood was seeping through the rags she had wrapped around her palms. The lime powder drifted up into her eyes, her throat, her lungs. She coughed until she couldn't stand straight. But by nightfall, a small patch of clean gray stone was visible in the bottom of the first vat. Tom climbed down to help the next day without being asked. Together, they scraped and scrubbed while Sam and Will hauled water from the creek. The work stretched into a second week, then a third. Barbara's hands split open in dozens of places, and the lime burned the wounds until she learned to rub tallow into her skin before descending. At night, she lay on the dirt floor of the tannery with her 3 boys huddled against her, still above ground, still cold, listening to the wind push through the gaps in the roof. She did not know if the vats would work. She only knew the alternative was waiting for winter in a crumbling shack that had already failed them. The first hard freeze arrived the 3rd week of October. But by then, 3 vats had been scraped clean, washed down with vinegar water to kill the lime residue, and lined with old grain sacks and quilts. Barbara lowered the boys into the largest one and climbed into another herself, pulling a plank across the top to hold body heat. That night, outside the tannery walls, the temperature dropped to 11 degrees. Inside the vat, Barbara Keating slept without shivering for the first time in weeks. The stone had drawn up the earth's warmth and cradled them through the darkness. But what she did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that the stench she had fought so hard to remove would prove to be the only thing standing between her children and the starving wolf packs that were already beginning to circle. And far out in the hills, something was gathering that would test that stench against a hunger more violent than winter itself. The hunger had begun months earlier, back when the last of the summer game faded from the high country. That autumn, the deer were scarce. The elk had moved farther west than anyone could remember, and the smaller creatures, the rabbits and the ground birds, seemed to have vanished into thin air. Old trappers said it was the drought. Preachers said it was judgment. But for the gray wolves of the northern territories, it was simply mathematics. When prey disappears, predators descend. And by the first week of November, their tracks were everywhere. The first attack happened 12 miles east of Barbara's Tannery, at a homestead run by the Dutton brothers. 3 men, 20 head of cattle, a stout barn. The wolves came at night, as they always do, slipping through a gap in the fence rails and pulling down a heifer before anyone even lit a lantern. By the time the Duttons reloaded their rifles, the pack had already dragged the carcass into the tree line. Only a long smear of frozen blood remained. 2 nights later, the Moffett family lost half their sheep. The night after that, a lone trapper named Early Parsons was found half-eaten near his campfire, his rifle still clutched in what remained of his hands. The settlement began to panic. Men who had spent years on the frontier speaking calmly of wolves now polished their shotgun barrels and barred their doors before sundown. Hunters were hired. Poisoned carcasses were left at the forest edge. But the wolves kept coming because this was not normal predation. This was a famine pack driven by starvation, and a starving wolf does not behave like a cautious wolf. It takes risks. It watches cabins in the daylight. It circles a homestead for days, learning its rhythms, waiting for a door left open, a child left alone, a single moment of carelessness. Barbara Keating heard the news from Isham Cole, the trapper who had known Elijah, when he rode out to check on her early in November. He stood in the doorway of the tannery, his face gray with cold and something darker, and told her about the Moffat sheep, about Early Parsons, about the tracks he had seen crossing the frozen creek less than 4 miles from her property. "They're getting bolder," he said quietly, watching the 3 boys huddled near the vat opening. "Starvation's doing something to 'em, making 'em wrong in the head." Then he looked at the thin plank walls of the building around them, the gaps in the roof, the single wooden door held shut by an iron bar, and his expression said everything words did not. "You can't stay here," Isham said. "Not with 3 young ones. Come back to town. The church'll take you in." Barbara refused. She had not scrubbed those vats until her hands bled, had not moved her entire life into a building that smelled of death, just to abandon it at the first sign of danger. Besides, she had noticed something. In the 3 weeks since they had moved in, not a single wolf track had been found closer than 100 yards from the tannery walls. Not one. Isham had not noticed this because Isham had not been looking for it, but Barbara had. Every morning she walked the perimeter studying the snow for prints. Deer tracks she found, rabbit tracks sometimes, but never the distinctive 4-toed print of a wolf. It was as if the animals were detouring around the property entirely, giving the tannery a wide berth that made no sense geographically but perfect sense olfactorily. Isham listened to her theory, frowned, and shook his head. "Smell don't stop a starving wolf," he said flatly. "I've seen 'em dig up weak old graves. I've seen 'em chew through a cabin door while the family screamed inside. You think old hide stink is gonna hold 'em? You're betting your children's lives on a ghost." But Barbara was not betting on a ghost. She was betting on the one thing Isham Cole and every other man on the frontier had refused to understand. The tannery stench was not merely bad odor. It was chemical. The lime pits, the tannin baths, the years of animal brain matter and crushed oak bark soaked into the soil around the building. These created a smell that was not just repulsive to humans but fundamentally alien to the hunting senses of a predator. A wolf tracks prey by scent, follows the distinct signature of warm flesh, fresh blood, human sweat. The tannery, saturated with the death smell of hundreds of processed hides, masked those signatures entirely. Beneath that foul blanket, Barbara and her boys did not smell like prey. They smelled like a place wolves instinctively avoided, the territory of something already dead and rotting, which in the wild means sickness, poison, or a rival's decayed kill. Barbara did not have the science to explain it that way. What she had was observation, and what she observed on the 13th of November would change everything. That afternoon, while dragging a sled of firewood from the tree line, she spotted the wolf. It was a large black-faced male, thin-ribbed and packing slowly along the frozen creek bed about 80 yards north of the tannery. Barbara froze. The wolf stopped too, lifting its head to test the air. For a long, terrible moment, the two stared at each other. Then the wolf did something unexpected. It sneezed twice, shook its head violently as if trying to clear its nostrils, and turned away. not cautiously, dismissively, as if whatever it smelled in the direction of the tannery had instantly removed all interest. Barbara watched it vanish into the brush, and the realization settled into her like cold iron. The stench was not just a nuisance, it was a repellent. But she also understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, that repellent only works as long as the hunger is not greater than the disgust. And the wolves were getting hungrier. The true test came on the 21st of November, when the first major blizzard of the season rolled down from the Canadian plains and buried the entire region under nearly 3 feet of snow in a single night. The storm was so violent that Barbara could not open the tannery door for 2 days. When she finally broke through on the third morning, she found a scene that stopped the breath in her chest. Wolf tracks. Not a few scattered prints, but a dense network of them, circling the building at a distance of about 50 yards, as if the pack had spent hours packing around the property while the snow fell. And here was the strange part. None of the tracks came closer than that invisible 50-yard line. It was a perfect circle, almost mathematical in its precision, with the tannery at the center. The wolves had surrounded them in the darkness, held back only by a barrier of stench. Barbara followed the tracks outward and discovered where the pack had left a gruesome message. Half buried in a drift behind the goat shed was the carcass of a mule deer, freshly killed and partially eaten. The wolves had dragged their kill to the boundary of the smell zone, fed there, and then abandoned the remains. They had not crossed the line, but they had eaten at its very edge, comfortable enough to feast in the shadow of the tannery, driven close enough by hunger that the disgust threshold was wearing thin. That evening, as she boiled the last of their dried beans over a small fire, Barbara did something she had not done since Elijah died. She cried, not from fear, though fear was there, but from the unbearable weight of a decision that had no right answer. If she stayed, the wolves would test the invisible boundary again and again, and sooner or later hunger would win. If she left, the journey to town with 3 small boys through predator-infested snow would almost certainly kill them before they reached help. The tannery was both their protection and their trap, and the wolves knew it. Tom watched her from the edge of the vat where he was rolling out the blankets for his brothers. He was 11 now, sharp-eyed and too serious for his age. "They're smart, aren't they?" he said quietly. "The wolves." Barbara wiped her eyes and nodded. "Smart enough to wait." But what none of them knew, what would not become clear until much later, was that the wolves were no longer simply circling by instinct. Something had changed in the pack dynamic. The black-phase male was not just any wolf. The settlers had a name for him. They called him Gable, after the preacher who had lost his leg to a bear in '61, because this wolf had a gait like a stooped old man, slow and deliberate, with one front paw that turned inward from an old trap injury. Gable was a survivor. He had learned to avoid poisoned meat, to circle around riflemen, to wait until the dogs were tied up before moving in. And according to Isham Cole, who had spent more time tracking him than any man alive, Gable had been driven out of his own pack by a younger rival, and was now leading a rogue group of outcast wolves, the desperate and the injured and the unusually cunning, the ones who had nothing left to lose and the cleverness to survive anyway. A rogue pack led by a rogue wolf, operating outside the normal patterns of caution, was the most dangerous kind of pack on the frontier. And Gable's tracks, Isham warned, had been spotted moving south, directly toward the tannery. The pivot point came on the morning of November 29th, when Barbara discovered something in the old leather-bound ledger book Dutch Haskins had left behind in a moldering chest. She had been using pages from it to start fires, tearing out the blank ones, but that morning she paused on a page written in Dutch's cramped, drunken hand. It was not a business record. It was a journal entry, dated December of 1871, the winter before Dutch died. The entry described a wolf attack on the tannery in his early years, before the smell had fully saturated the ground. 3 wolves had broken through a window and killed his dog. Dutch had responded by dumping an entire barrel of fermented tanning liquor, a foul mixture of oak galls, urine, and rancid fat, around the perimeter of the building, and soaking the soil thoroughly. He had done it out of fury, not strategy, But the wolves never returned. Not that winter, not ever. Below the entry in a later hand, Dutch had written a single line that made Barbara's skin go cold. The old trappers say wolves will not cross ground where the dead have been worked. The smell of tanning is the smell of a kill already claimed. They think a bigger predator lives here. A bigger predator. That was the key. The tannery stench did not simply mask human scent. It mimicked the territorial marking of a large carnivore, something that had killed here repeatedly, something the wolves read as a threat too dangerous to challenge. As long as the smell held, Gable's pack would hesitate. But Barbara knew enough about wolves to understand that even the strongest territorial marker fades. The snow diluted it. The wind carried it away. And Gable's hunger was pressing him closer every night. The question was no longer whether the barrier would be tested. The question was how long before a starving, desperate, brilliantly cunning wolf decided that whatever monster lived inside that foul building was less dangerous than the empty belly of winter. That night, the temperature dropped to 14 below zero. The wolves howled from the tree line, a chorus of thin, hungry voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. Will woke screaming from a nightmare. Sam pressed himself against the stone wall of the vat, trembling. And Tom, holding a heavy iron poker across his knees, looked up at his mother with eyes that had grown too old too fast. "How long can we hold them off?" he asked. Barbara could not answer, because even as she listened to the howls, she was calculating the things she had left to trade. 1 can of kerosene, a rusted hatchet, salt for the goat, enough dried meat for maybe 10 days, and a single bottle of the same fermented tanning liquor Dutch had used all those years ago, still sealed in a stone jug at the back of the supply chest. If the worst came, she could pour it around the walls, reapply the stench, reset the boundary. But that was a finite resource, and the wolves were not finite. They were patient, and they were coming. And somewhere out in the darkness, Gable was watching the building with yellow eyes that missed nothing. The waiting ended on the second night of December, when the temperature plunged to 22 below, and the prairie fell so silent that Barbara could hear her own heartbeat in the darkness. The boys were sleeping inside the deepest vat, piled beneath every blanket they owned, and the fire in the iron stove had burned down to a dull orange glow. Outside, the moon was barely a sliver, but the snow caught what little light remained and scattered it across the tannery yard in pale gray sheets. It was enough to see movement, and at the edge of the tree line, something was moving. Barbara stood at the window with a wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She had not slept in 3 nights, not truly, because she had learned to read the wolves' patterns the way her husband had once read river currents. The pack had been pressing closer every evening, testing the boundary in small increments. She had found tracks at 40 yards, then 30, then 20. The invisible shield was thinning, and Gable's patience, she suspected, was running out. Then she saw it. A dark shape detoured from the pack at the tree line. It came forward alone, slow and deliberate, one paw turning inward with that unmistakable hobble. Gable himself making his approach. Her hand tightened on the hatchet she kept beside the window. The wolf stopped at the 10-yard mark, well inside the perimeter that had held for weeks. He stood there for a long moment, yellow eyes fixed on the tannery, ears pricked forward with a curiosity that was somehow worse than aggression. Barbara did not breathe. She watched him lift his nose, test the air, shake his head once, then take another step forward. Another. The barrier was no longer enough. The stench had faded just enough that a starving wolf, a clever wolf, had decided to risk it. Gable lowered his head and walked deliberately toward the goat shed on the south side of the building. The goat screamed before Barbara could reach the door. By the time she threw the iron bar open and rushed outside with the hatchet raised, Gable had already pulled the animal halfway through the broken shed door. The pack surged forward behind him, dark shapes pouring across the snow line. Barbara swung the hatchet at the nearest wolf, a gaunt gray female, catching it across the shoulder. The animal yelped and spun away, but 2 more replaced it instantly. She could smell them now, a wet reek of pine needles and old blood, so different from the chemical rot of the tannery. She grabbed the goat by the collar and yanked, but Gable did not release his grip. His eyes met hers, and for one frozen moment she understood the full depth of his need. Then a gunshot cracked across the clearing. Tom stood in the doorway, the old flintlock rifle his father had left behind braced against his shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. The shot had been wild, aimed at the sky, but the noise scattered the pack like a stone through still water. Gable released the goat and backed away, not fleeing, merely retreating a few paces into the darkness. The others melted back behind him, and within seconds the yard was empty again. Only the blood, the broken shed door, and the trembling goat remained. Barbara snatched the rifle from Tom and thrust the hatchet into his hands. "Get inside the vat," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Take Will and Sam. Do not come out until I tell you." Tom nodded once and disappeared into the tannery. She loaded the rifle with shaking fingers that had forgotten nothing Elijah had taught her years ago at the target stumps. Then she did the only thing left. She retrieved the stone jug of fermented tanning liquor from the back of the supply chest. The liquid was thick and black, the color of old tea that had soured into poison. Its smell was so vicious that it made the normal tannery stench seem like fresh bread. Dutch Haskins had brewed it 18 years ago as a final resort, and even now, as Barbara uncorked it beneath the open sky, the fumes made her eyes sting. She carried the jug to the perimeter of the building, walking the same invisible circle the wolves had respected for weeks, and she poured. Slowly, deliberately, she walked a line of the black liquor around the entire foundation, across the door threshold, along the base of the wooden walls. Each step left a dark stain on the snow that steamed faintly even in the frozen air. When the jug was empty, she stood back and let the reek rise into the night. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then the howling started again, but this time it was different. Higher pitched, more agitated, overlapping in patterns that were not the confident chorus she had grown used to. The pack was scattered, confused. She heard the thump of paws retreating through the underbrush, the snap of branches, a single sharp yelp as if a dispute had broken out among them. And then, slowly, silence. The kind of silence that meant the wolves had withdrawn beyond the tree line, beyond the creek bed, beyond the range of hearing. Gable had tested the barrier and found it rearmed at a level even he was not desperate enough to cross. Not yet. By dawn, the snow had covered the bloodstains. Barbara examined the perimeter and found the tracks she expected. A dense confusion of prints at the tree line, a single set of Gable's hobbled paw marks standing apart from the rest, facing the tannery as if he had watched for hours before finally retreating. But there was something else. A new set of tracks led away from the property, not toward the high country where the pack usually hunted, but east, directly toward the clustered homesteads along Willow Creek. She counted the prints carefully. At least 8, maybe 10 wolves traveling with purpose. The dread settled into her stomach before the horse appeared on the horizon. It was Isham Cole, riding hard, his coat flapping open despite the cold. He pulled up at the tannery door and did not dismount. His face was gray, the color of a man who had seen something that would never leave him. "The Larsons," he said, and his voice cracked on the name. "The wolves hit the Larson place last night, maybe 2 hours before dawn. They got in through the back door, killed Martha and both the little girls. Jack survived, but he's torn up bad. I ain't ever seen anything like it." Barbara leaned against the door frame. The words hit her like physical blows. Martha Larson, who had brought her cornbread the week after Elijah died. The 2 girls, Ruth and May, who played with Will outside the general store while Barbara counted her pennies. Gone. Isham looked down at the dark stain of the tanning liquor still visible around the foundation. He looked at the tracks, the broken shed, the blood on the snow. And then he looked east, toward the Larson homestead and the line of wolf prints vanishing in that direction. "They came from here," he said, not accusing, almost gentle. "Didn't they?" Barbara could not lie. She told him everything: the pack, the test, the reapplication, the retreat, the tracks heading east. Isham listened in silence, his breath steaming in the dawn air. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and his words carried the weight of a man who had spent years on the frontier learning the hardest truth of all. "You saved your own," he said quietly. "And the wolves took the next house they found. That's the way of it out here. The wolves don't pick their targets. They pick the one that ain't protected." The rumors spread faster than the cold. By midday, a group of 8 men gathered at the trading post, and by sundown they were riding toward the tannery. Barbara saw them coming as the last light drained out of the sky. She sent the boys to the vats and stood in the doorway with the rifle cradled in her arms. The men were led by Jack Larson, bandaged and barely able to stand, but upright with a fury that defied his injuries. Beside him were the Dutton brothers, the Moffat boys, and 3 other homesteaders whose names Barbara did not know but whose faces were cold as the iron sky above them. They reined up in the yard and sat their horses in a line, a frontier jury without mercy. "That smell you keep pouring around this place," one of the Duttons called out. "It drove the wolves onto the Larsons." "We found the tracks. They came from here." Barbara did not lower the rifle. "I did not send the wolves to their door," she said. "I only kept them from mine." "You made your place a fortress and left the rest of us open," another man shouted. "That ain't surviving, that's murder by neglect." The words hung in the cold air. Jack Larson, his voice raw with grief, spoke for the first time. "My wife is dead. My little girls are dead. And you're standing there in their blood, telling me you did what you had to do." Barbara looked at him and saw not anger but a hollow emptiness that was far worse. She knew then that no explanation would be enough. The frontier did not forgive women who survived while others perished. It called them witches, or it called them cowards, or it called them cursed. It never called them right. Isham Cole, who had ridden in behind the group, pushed his horse forward and placed himself between Barbara and the men. "You want to hang someone for this, you start with the wolves, not the widow," he said. "Gable's been coming for months. The smell kept him away from here, but he would have hit somewhere else anyway. The pack's starving. Blaming her don't change that." The argument that followed lasted until full dark. Voices rose and fell. Threats were made, positions shifted, alliances formed and broke. In the end, the men did not burn the tannery. They did not drag Barbara out into the snow. But they made their judgment clear. No one would trade with her. No one would help her. No one would come when the wolves returned, because in the eyes of the community, Barbara Keating had chosen her family over theirs, and the frontier had a long memory for that kind of choice. When the riders finally left, Barbara stood alone in the doorway until the cold forced her inside. She climbed into the vat beside her sleeping boys and lay awake listening to the wind. The liquor was gone. The rifle had 2 shots. The goat was injured, and beyond the tree line, Gable was still out there, a survivor like her, learning from every encounter and waiting for the exact moment when the defense would fail. But the wolves were only half the calculation now. The greater danger lay not in the forest but in the settlement, where desperate men were remembering that a building full of hatred and stench had once belonged to a drunk named Dutch, and that perhaps the fastest way to solve the wolf problem was to remove the thing that drew them in the first place. Barbara had saved her boys from the predators outside. The predators inside, the ones with human faces and broken hearts, were only beginning to circle. And somewhere in the darkness, a hobbled wolf howled once, a single note that sounded almost like a question. The final attack came at moonrise on the 9th of December, when the wind died completely and the prairie held its breath under a sky the color of old bone. Barbara had been expecting it. In the week since Jack Larson and his men had ridden away, Gable's pack had not traveled east again. They had stayed close, circling the tannery in tightening loops, leaving fresh tracks each morning that pressed incrementally inward. The liquor barrier was holding, but Barbara could see the edges of it fatting where wind-blown snow had diluted the black stains. She had nothing left to pour. The rifle had 2 shots. The hatchet was sharp, but it would not stop 8 wolves. And so she waited with her 3 boys huddled in the deepest vat beneath every blanket they owned, and she prayed. The first wolf came over the drift wall near the goat shed, a lean gray female with eyes that caught the thin moonlight like chips of glass. She paused, lowered her head, and sneezed twice against the stench, but she did not retreat. Behind her, a second wolf, then a third, emerged from the tree line. Then Gable himself, limping forward with that inward-turned paw, his massive black head low and his lips slightly parted, tasting the air. The pack fanned out around the building in a loose formation, a crescent of hunger at 20 yards, silently tightening. Barbara stood in the doorway with the flintlock raised, her finger on the trigger. She did not waste a shot on the gray female. She aimed directly at Gable, the brain of the pack, the one who had learned too much. The shot cracked across the frozen plain. The ball hit him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways with a yelp that was half fury and half pain, but he did not drop. He scrambled up again, blood darkening the snow, and a sound erupted from his throat that was deeper than a growl, more like a command. The pack surged, but here is where the thing happened that no one expected, not even Barbara. The wolves hit the invisible boundary of the liquor-soaked ground and broke apart as if striking glass. The lead female skidded to a halt barely 5 yards from the door, shaking her head violently, foam flecking from her jaws where the chemical reek had burned her nose. 2 others veered off wildly, colliding with each other in their desperation to escape the stench. One juvenile, too young to know better, pressed forward another yard and then collapsed in a convulsive fit of gagging, rolling in the snow before scrambling backward. The attack was not just stopped, it was shattered. Gable stood alone at the boundary line, blood dripping from his shoulder, staring at Barbara with eyes that held something almost like understanding. He had tested her twice now, and twice he had failed. The pack, leaderless and confused, retreated to the tree line, whining and snapping at the air. Gable remained for one long moment, then turned his massive head toward the east, toward the settlement where the smell of wood smoke and livestock blood carried cleanly on the wind. Barbara watched him calculate, and her heart sank. He was choosing a softer target, and this time the people he found would have no barrier at all. She did not sleep. She reloaded the rifle with her last ball and powder and paced the tannery floor, waiting for the screams that she knew would come. But the night remained silent. Dawn broke pale and cold, and Isham Cole appeared on the trail, riding slower than usual, his face unreadable. Barbara stepped outside to meet him, the empty rifle still in her hands. "Did they hit someone else?" she asked. Her voice was raw. "They tried," Isham said. "The settlement knew they were coming." Jack Larson had men posted every night since his family died. When the pack crossed the creek, they were waiting. 4 rifles cut him down in the first volley. Gable got hit again. "I tracked his blood for 3 miles before it stopped. I think he's dead." Barbara leaned against the door frame and let the weight of it settle over her. The predator that had haunted her, that had forced her to become something she never wanted to be, was gone. And she had not killed him. The community had. The same community that had blamed her, that had called her a murderer by neglect, had taken up arms because of what happened to the Larsons. Tragedy had forced preparation. Her survival had not doomed others. It had warned them. But the men who rode out to the tannery that afternoon were not coming with apologies. They were coming with a question, the same question Gideon Pike had asked Parker Vale when he saw the drift wall. Jack Larson, his bandages still fresh, stood in the yard and looked at the black stain around the foundation, at the tracks of wolves that had fled in panic, at the healthy goat and the intact door. Then he looked at Barbara. "How?" he asked. Just that word. Barbara did not answer with a speech. She went inside the tannery and returned with Dutch Haskins's ledger. She opened it to the page where Dutch had described the tanning liquor, the barrel of fermented oak galls and urine and rancid fat that had soaked the ground and kept the wolves at bay for years. She handed the ledger to Jack Larson, and the men crowded around to read it by lantern light. "Ain't the hides," Isham Cole muttered, tracing a finger over the cramped writing. "It's the tannin, the acid in the oak bark, the salts. It mimics the scent of a big predator's territory marking. Something that kills here regular. The wolves think this place is already claimed," Barbara said quietly, "by something they're afraid of." The men exchanged glances. The Dutton brothers looked at the tannery walls, at the vats where 3 small boys now peered out timidly, and for the first time their faces held not suspicion but something closer to respect. Jack Larson closed the ledger and handed it back. His voice shook when he spoke. "Could you teach us how to make the liquor? My wife and girls are gone, but there are other families out there, families with little ones. If what you did here can save them." Barbara looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had stood in her yard and called her a murderer. Now he was asking for her help. The frontier did not forgive easily, but it also did not forget who had the knowledge to survive. She nodded once, and so the lessons began. Over the next 2 weeks, as the winter deepened into its hardest stretch, homesteaders from across the basin came to the hated tannery. Barbara showed them how Dutch had brewed the liquor from materials every settler had: oak bark, which grew along every creek bed; animal urine, which collected naturally in the barn; spoiled fat, which no one used for cooking. She taught them to pour a wide circle around their homes, to reapply it when the snow diluted the scent, to pay attention to the wind direction and the approach paths wolves used. She did not lecture. She simply showed the way Parker Vale had walked men through his cedar rings, letting the evidence speak for itself. Tom helped her. He had become a quiet, watchful boy, and he had learned to read wolf tracks as his father had once read timber. He showed the men how to find the boundary line where the smell weakened, how to reinforce it before the pack tested it. Sam and Will carried buckets of boiled water and ground oak bark, small hands shaking from cold but steady with purpose. The tannery, which had been a curse, slowly became something else: a laboratory, a fortress, a school. The winter of 1879 became known in the territory as the Howling Winter, the season when starving wolf packs swept down from the north and devastated unprotected homesteads. Across the basin, families who had armed themselves and barricaded their doors still lost livestock, still found tracks on their porches, still heard the screams of animals pulled down in the dark. But the homes that had applied Barbara's ring of tanning liquor, the families who had learned to make their property smell like a predator's kill zone, lost nothing. Not a single animal, not a single child. The wolves detoured around those farms the way water detours around a stone, searching for easier prey and not finding it. The men who had once threatened Barbara Keating never apologized. Frontier pride did not allow that, but they sent their wives with salt and flour. They sent their sons with firewood. In the spring, when the snow melted and the first pale shoots of grass appeared, they helped her repair the tannery roof and build a proper door. The settlement had not forgotten the Larsons, would never forget them, but it had learned that survival was not a zero-sum game. Barbara's defense had not drawn the wolves to others. It had forced the wolves to reveal their patterns, to scatter, to become targets. And Gable. Isham Cole found his body in late March, frozen beneath a fallen pine 3 miles east of the basin. The old wolf had died not from bullets but from starvation, his ribs visible through a pelt that had once been thick and black. He had led his pack through the worst winter in memory, but the prey had been too scarce and the territory too well defended. The predator that could not adapt to Barbara's barrier had died the way all things die on the frontier, slowly, alone, and in the cold. Barbara buried him. Not out of sentiment, but out of respect for an adversary that had, in its own way, taught her everything she needed to know about the land. Then she went back to the tannery and scrubbed the vats one more time, not with quicklime now, but with fresh water and a little soap, because they were not just shelter anymore. They were home. The tannery stood for more than 30 years after that winter. Barbara raised her 3 boys inside those stone walls, and they grew into men who understood that the things the world rejects, the foul smells and the cursed buildings and the unlucky ideas, sometimes hold the key to survival. Tom became a trapper, specializing in wolf patterns that homesteaders paid him to map. Sam took over the land when Barbara grew old, expanding the property into a proper ranch with a reputation for never losing livestock. Will married a girl from the settlement and built a house on the far edge of the property, near the old tree line where Gable had once watched and waited. And Barbara, she lived to see her grandchildren play in the same stone vats that had once been soaked in rotting hides, their laughter echoing off the limestone walls that had never once frozen, not in the harshest winter, not in the deepest cold. She never remarried. She never left the tannery. And in the quiet evenings, when the wind blew from the north and the wolves began to howl in the far hills, she would stand at the door with a cup of cold tea and let the old smell, faint now but still present, wash over her. It no longer smelled like death to her. It smelled like safety. What Barbara Keating understood, what it took the rest of the basin years to learn, was not just that the tannery stench repelled wolves. It was that every frontier has predators, visible and invisible, and the only defense that works against a hungry world is the one the world itself cannot stand to approach. She had bought a cursed building for $8, scrubbed its filth with her own bleeding hands, and discovered that the very thing everyone else ran from was the thing that would keep her children alive. Was she a desperate widow stumbling onto luck? Or was she the one person in the basin willing to see value where everyone else saw only rot? The wolves, at least, had an answer to that question. They never crossed the line. The wolves had understood long before the people did. They circled that line for 7 winters, testing it each January when hunger pressed hardest, and each time the invisible wall held. It was not the strength of Barbara's walls that kept them out. It was the thing everyone had told her to be ashamed of, the stench, the rot, the legacy of a dead drunk's failed trade. The frontier taught its people to fear what smelled wrong, what looked broken, what couldn't be cleaned or sold or made respectable. But the wolves taught something else. They taught that the thing you run from might be the only thing that saves you. And isn't that the pattern? It was there in Parker Vale's rings of fragile saplings, mocked by every hardened settler who passed, until the blizzard itself built a fortress around his family. It was there in Barbara Keating's cursed tannery, bought for $8 and scrubbed with bleeding hands, until the stench that drove people away drove death away too. The world calls some ideas crazy because it hasn't yet seen the winter that will prove them necessary. The question that lingers is this: was Barbara Keating brilliant, or was she simply a woman with no other choice? When every path leads to loss, you start looking at the paths no one else will walk. You see a stone vat not as a rotting pit but as a winter bedroom. You see a foul smell not as a curse but as a weapon. You see $8 not as the last of your money but as the first installment on survival. The line between desperation and genius is drawn only in retrospect, and the people who cross it rarely know which side they're on until the thaw comes. Barbara's 3 boys grew up inside that ring of invisible safety. They carried the lesson forward into their own lives, not just about wolves, but about assumptions. The frontier was full of men who died because they trusted what looked strong. The ones who lived often trusted what looked wrong, simply because they had paid attention. The tannery's legacy outlived its smell. Long after the last trace of Dutch Haskins's liquor had faded into the soil, the families who had learned to pour that ring of protection kept it ready, a recipe passed down like a family name. In the old ledgers of the county, the tannery was never listed as a residence. It was still zoned as industrial, still technically abandoned, still considered unfit for human habitation. But inside those walls, children were born, winters were weathered, and a family grew roots in the most unlikely ground. Perhaps that's the real reason the story survived. Not because it's about wolves or widows or the frontier, but because at some point every one of us has stood in front of something the world called worthless and wondered if we were the crazy ones for seeing value there. Barbara Keating didn't just buy a building. She bought the thing everyone else had rejected, and she made it into something that outlasted their scorn. The wolves stayed on their side of the line. The people eventually came to her for help, and the tannery, that foul, cursed, hated place, became a home. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe now to witness more forgotten accounts of frontier survival, where the line between ruin and refuge was often thinner than a coat of frost. Hit the bell, and we'll see you in the next one. The winters are long, but the stories are longer.